And we are live. Welcome back to the Starboard Portal, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We have a great session kicking off with John Pearce, who's going to be talking about squaring the pyramid and encouraging lifelong participation in sport. And then later this afternoon, we'll be joined by Jack Gearhart, our CEO of US Sailing, for an Ask Me Anything question. As John's speaking today, feel free to drop questions and comments in the live chat, and he will pick those up as he's talking about these fantastic concepts.
Thanks, Brittany. Hope everybody's well. Happy to be here to kind of talk youth sailing and get a little crazy, get a little conceptual, and hopefully distract everybody from their day-to-day and give you some stuff to look forward to for once we get back out on the water. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen right
everybody's
now.
Well. Happy to be here to kind of talk youth sailing
things off
and get a little crazy, get a
so,
little conceptual. And
so yeah, my name's John Pearce. I'm the youth director
from
their
US
day-to-day,
and give you
I've been working here for
once we get back out on the water.
Almost 4 years now.
Go ahead
and before that, I was a college sailing coach.
Happy to be here to kind of talk youth
kick things off.
And get a little crazy, get a
so,
little conceptual. And
so yeah, my name's John Pearce. I'm the youth director
from their US day-to-day and give you
I've been working here for
okay, we got a little technical issue.
Almost 4 years now.
Go ahead
and before that,
screen.
I can kill YouTube. How's that? You think that's better? Let's see. Let's see if that's better. I'm used to doing this presentation with real people in real sailing clubs and things like that. So bear with us while we do this virtually. We're adapting to the new virtual world or whatever. But yeah, I was a college sailing coach for a long time, worked at George Washington University, Dartmouth College, Stanford University, and Hobart and William Smith. Before that, I went to Hobart and William Smith for my undergrad. Grew up in upstate New York, Ithaca, New York, sailing on the Finger Lakes, mostly sailing lasers, but also keel boats and windsurfing and whatever else we could get up to in the summer. And we are going to roll through some youth sailing topics here. Mike, are we good?
You're in good shape.
Okay, good. Tech says we're good, so let's get rolling. So some of you maybe have seen parts of this presentation before, Squaring the Pyramid. This is a new version of it, kind of taking a hybrid of a presentation that is about 1.5 years old and adding in some stuff that was developed for this year's Sailing Leadership Forum, which was back in February. And Nevin Sayre and I did a presentation about adventure sailing. And so shout out to Nevin. He's done great work with the adventure sailing concept and the unregatta, and have a few of his slides in here. So I want to give him credit for that. And then I also want to just note here that we're going to be talking about a lot of stuff from other sports, and need you to take the mental leap with me that we're not that different. Sailing is not that different from other activities or sports. And there we go. Nice. And we can apply what works elsewhere to what we do. And, you know, we don't need to reinvent the wheel every single time. But sailing is obviously special. So we want to keep that special part of it. All right. So here we go. Let's square the pyramid. So this is all about teaching and retaining lifelong sailors. You know, we're going to see here a lot of good reasons why retention is a key metric, and that teaching skills and building well-rounded sailors will then lead to all the positive outcomes, whether it's high-level racing, whether it's participation, yacht club membership, you name it. So before I get started here, in the comments section, I see a lot of people in there already. So shout out to all you all. If you could just write in the comments real quick, just what organization or organizations you're with and kind of what your role is. Are you a volunteer? Are you a parent? Are you a coach? Are you a sailor? Just dump that into the YouTube comment sections there, and that'll help us kind of get started. So take a minute. Don't be shy. This is going to be an interactive presentation. That's solid. Here. All right, I see it rolling in. Lurker, Ned Jones, appropriate. All right, so a little overview here. Now that we know who you are and hoping to get some good comments and questions in the chat function, so don't be shy in there. What's the point of this presentation? I want to cut to the chase. You're probably wondering, should I check this out or maybe I'll go do something else with my day? There's a lot of other live streams out there. So what's the point? The point is of this presentation that focusing on retention as the key metric for youth sailing is not only going to help grow the sport, but it also will increase our long-term competitive success as a sport. Point number 2 is that sampling a lot of different types of sailing, as opposed to specializing on certain types of sailing or certain roles or certain boats, increases not just the sailor retention, so it leads to that retention goal, but it also makes for better learning retention, which again makes for more skilled, more capable sailors. And then the last piece here is going to be that informal learning is just as important as formal learning. So I'm going to make the argument here that the things you do out on your own as a sailor, the projects you take on, the challenges that you figure out for yourself are just as important, if not more important, than the formal learning you get through being coached at a program or things like that. So that's the thesis here. So I'm going to dive into the squaring the pyramid part. The pyramid is sort of a classic sports analogy, right? When you talk about sort of progression, pathways, whatever, often it starts with a whiteboard and some and a triangle drawn on there. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. The pyramid obviously has a good visual for the progression from early learning through to higher levels of competition and eventually elite competition. But especially in a sport like sailing, where participation for a lifetime is really the outcome, and that many of our most successful sailors are not young. They're in their 40s, 50s, even 60s and beyond. So the pyramid approach is not necessarily going to lead to the big, broader outcomes that our sport wants and our sport is designed for. So the issue here is that the only path that really is shown is for the elite competitor. At the end, there's the last person standing. And the narrative, if you're a sailor, a parent, whatever, you look at this and eventually think, well, at some point, I'm going to go off the edge of the pyramid, and that's sort of the farthest I can go, right? Which is really just not true in sailing. There's always something next. There's always more stuff to do. So when we're trying to address everyone else, that's where this squaring the pyramid kind of concept comes through. And this is borrowed from US lacrosse. We didn't come up with squaring the pyramid, something that they had. We asked them if we could borrow it, and they said, sure. So we've been using that metaphor internally and in these kind of presentations to explain this approach that's designed for retention. So there's a saying out there that what gets measured becomes what matters. So what are our key measurements in our sport? A lot of it might have to do with how many days you get on the water. That would be a great measurement. How many hours you put in, that's something you'll hear from coaches a lot. You got to put in the hours, time on the water, time on the water, time on the water. You might also, have the measurement of, success. If you're racing, are you winning? Are you performing better, getting personal bests that you haven't had before? But in terms of more globally, if I was a sailing organization or for us as US Sailing, measuring retention is going to make a lot of sense. And that's really something we should focus on. And it's something that other sports are focusing on. So these slides here are borrowed from Nevin Sayre, his adventure sailing presentation. And I believe these are fairly anecdotal. So this kind of data is the type of thing that we as an organization want to collect and present as a yearly kind of metric, so that we can track exactly what the participation rates are at different ages and where the drop-offs are. But essentially what you're looking at here is the sailing participation by age, which is roughly what's observed at the junior sailing program level. Lots of 8 and 10-year-olds, a little bit less middle school aged, a lot less high school aged, and then, some tough times in the 20s for folks who are sort of starting their lives and starting careers, versus the high retention. And obviously with high retention, everything is going to improve. Not only the growth and participation levels in the sport, but also the pool of athletes that are going to be successful in competition. So I want to play a little video here for you from the Aspen Institute. And this is going to connect into how this is all sort of part of a bigger, broader movement nationally in youth sports to focus on retention. So this is from an organization called Project Play, which is a part of the Aspen Institute, a really, really good organization. Highly recommend Googling Project Play and checking out their resources. They have a lot of really data-driven stuff from all different sports. They track very closely the participation rates in different sports and the ebbs and flows, and really good resources for organizational leaders as well. So their kind of core thing is what they call the 8 plays. And these are recommendations for organizations to kind of revamp their approach to youth sports and lead to a healthy youth sports environment. So play number 1 is ask kids what they want. And at the last couple of Sailing Leadership Forums, National Sailing Program Symposium, some of the U.S. Sailing Regional Symposiums, we've done a panel of ask kids what they want. And it's really easy. You just get 3 or 4 sailors who are, youth, put them up in front of the symposium or the meeting and ask them questions and see what they want and really get it straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak. So that's a really great thing to do. And there's a reason that's their number 1 play, is that we're really trying to speak to what kids want. It's not about what the adults want. Play number 2 is reintroduce free play, meaning that everything doesn't have to be so structured all the time. There's a time and a place for a structured practice, but there's also a time and a place to just go out on the playing field, whatever that is, and just experiment, play around with your friends, make up your own games, and just have some fun with it. And that's certainly true in sailing. Encourage sport sampling. So there's a big problem with kids specializing in a specific sport right from the beginning as 6 or 8 or 10-year-olds, rather than experimenting with a variety of sports. And the data shows that the retention, the highest retained athletes, and the highest performing athletes are multi-sport athletes. So specializing early is not productive. It may be productive in the very short term and lead to a short-term outcome, but it's not going to lead to the long-term outcomes that we want. Revitalize in-town leagues. So that's focusing on local competition rather than, national, international kind of competition. It'll be interesting to see it through this whole coronavirus crisis here, when we come out the other side and people are still not traveling too much, whether there's an uptick in the local racing scene for youth racing, and adult racing for that matter. So those are a couple of the plays there. You can see what the other ones are. I'm going to go ahead and play this video. And Brittany, let me know if this doesn't work on your end.
At this level, should I try another sport?
Start from the beginning.
I've given a lot of thought to this, and I'm here to announce my retirement from sports. Soccer, tennis, volleyball, I've taken my game as far as it can go. The pressure it takes to play at 9 is not what I expected when I started at 5. I'm done with parents picking apart my every move when I just need time to figure it out on my own. I'm through with the coaches that think I'm not strong enough or smart enough, even though my body and brain are still growing. I'll miss my teammates, but I obviously can't compete at this level. Should I try another sport? I think it's a little late for that. So I'm just going to retire. Any questions?
So that's a little presentation there from Project Play, obviously meant to pull on the heartstrings. That was part of their campaign this past year called Don't Retire Kid. There's a ton of other good videos on there and a lot of good resources, particularly from professional athletes talking to kids about why to stick with it, or also to parents and to organizations on how to help kids stick with it. The drop-off rate, as you saw there in that video, is super high at the sort of 10, 11, 12-year-old age range, which is a shame. So all these different organizations recognize that. What I think is a really key point here is that the U.S. Olympic Committee, the USOPC, as it's now called, also recognizes this. And you would think, oh, U.S. Olympic Committee, they're focused on the elite development, the top handful of athletes in the country. But in fact, they're putting a ton of energy across all the national governing bodies into promoting the grassroots, early sport experience, and recognizing the fact that if we don't have a lot of athletes sticking with their sport at those early ages, then we're not going to be successful as a country at the high levels. And we're also not going to be as, healthy and happy and have all those other good outcomes of sport. So this is their athlete development model. It's called the American Development Model. So you can Google it if you want to see more information. What their approach here is they have these 5 stages, and each one of these is sort of designed for a different age range. And it talks about the sport experience at each age and how that differs. So for example, stage 1 here with the youngest kids, discover, learn, and play, right? That's what's important when you're just getting started and when you're a younger kid in sports. That's it. Discover, learn, and play. The next age level up, develop and challenge. That's when you're starting to, ratchet it up a little bit and challenge kids to learn, challenge them to take on new challenges, stuff like that. And then it starts to ladder up to train and compete, which is beginning to look a little bit more like the formal sport instruction, and performance development that we're used to seeing. So USA Hockey is a sport organization that has really been on the vanguard of this from the beginning. They actually coined the phrase, the American Development Model. And they have done a great job over the last 10 plus years developing, kind of revamping their whole sport to be kid-centric at these younger age levels, doing age-appropriate practices and game formats, promoting physical literacy, pushing coaching resources out there, practice plans, videos, training templates. They have 10 regional managers around the country who are kind of youth hockey experts for their regions. That's something that we're sort of emulating with the Siebel Sailors program with our Siebel coaches around the country. And you can see here from these visuals, I'll zoom in a little bit, what they've done. And we've heard from this guy, Ken Martell, who's their national guy on all this American Development Model stuff. They've split the ice up into 3 sections, and they can get so many more kids on the ice if they're playing these different games in different sections and kind of rotating through these stations as a part of their practice. So they have these great statistics on the number of puck touches that a kid gets in this format, where there's a ton of pucks in the ice, there's kids everywhere, there's different activities, it's just nonstop entertainment, versus the old way where it was just one team of kids on an entire sheet of ice that's way too big for them, and they get hardly any puck touches, and they basically just skate around and slide all over the place. And the way they visualize this here with this carnival on ice, I think is awesome. Every time a kid shows up to hockey practice, they want it so that the kid looks out on the ice and they're imagining all this fun and excitement that's going to be out there. And, the same could apply to sailing, right? Our playground is out on the water. And when a kid rigs up that boat and pushes off the dock, they should be thinking about all the fun and adventures that are going to be out there. So I want to take a brief pause here. This would be a good time for any questions. And I also want to just put the prompt out there. If you could put something in the comment section, why do kids stop sailing? Or maybe you have anyone specifically that you could think of. Why would a kid stop? What are the barriers? What are the experiences that lead to that? What are the challenges? So we'll let that run for a second. And I see a lot of great people in the chat box here. Will Howard up in the Chicago area. JSA is on here in Long Island Sound. I'm sure everybody is working hard to figure out how to get back up and running here soon. But go ahead and throw some comments in there. Why do kids stop sailing? It's a little sad, but while you're doing that, I'll point out here that USA Hockey has also done a really good job working with their organizations to show how this focus on high retention is not just a feel good, do good type activity. This is really good for the business of the organizations that they work with, the bottom line. So they have this sort of case study here. And this is the business model here of a low retention kind of standard youth hockey program. So you can see that year to year, there's a drop off of roughly 200 hockey players in the first year, 100, stays steady, lose another 50. And each year that amount of revenue goes down. And obviously this is just very simple math. The high retention here, where they've only lost about 50 kids in year one, and then by year 5 there, they've only lost about 100, leading to much more money. And it's interesting, you know, they have videos out there on USA Hockey's YouTube page of people who are running youth hockey organizations, and they're saying, you know, we started doing this and we weren't really convinced. And then when we saw the high retention kick in, we saw how good it was for our business and also how good it was for the kids and for the sport. So pretty compelling stuff there. So lots of good stuff coming in on the comments. Too many other demands. The pressure to do one sport, scheduling, the practical scheduling aspect of how many things can you juggle at one time. That's huge. Not interested in racing. You know, what's the next avenue once you're a good sailor, but you don't really feel like racing right now? Ned Jones asks, what's the number reason I think kids drop out? I think there's a whole lot of kids who start sailing and learn, take a couple lessons, do a little summer session, and then they just are never asked to come back. And I think that's something we should all, starting with US Sailing, do a better job of communicating to those new kids and new parents who, you know, sailing is just another one of those things that's out there, along with gymnastics and bocce and rock climbing and basket weaving. And, you know, we got to do a better job of really asking them, hey, come back, keep coming back. So there's like a marketing play there, I think. All right, so next up here, we're going to talk a little bit about pathways. And this is sort of the flip side of the pyramid. This is the square, I suppose, even though you can see there are still some sort of pyramid-y shapes in there. But this is just a very general model to show a skills-based progression that leads not just to racing and high-performance racing, but also leads to big boat sailing, offshore sailing, and just recreational small boat sailing, the type of sailing that most adults do. And it makes clear sense that we should be trying to connect the sailing that kids do directly to the sailing that adults do, so that when kids become adults, they can keep doing it. And often there's not a direct connection there, or it can be a little blurry. So, you know, one of the things we're working on is building out these skill levels so that it's not just an abstract concept, but that sailors and programs and coaches can actually follow along and make sure sailors are attaining all the skills in each one of these building blocks. And as you get to the higher levels, it obviously becomes a lot more specialized and maybe a little bit more dependent on exactly what equipment you're using. But at those sort of beginner, intermediate, and sort of introduction to racing or introduction to big boat sailing levels, it's pretty much just broad skills, right? It's how to sail well, how to sail fast, how to sail safely, how to use equipment on different types of boats. Can you use a winch? Can you anchor? And I suppose part of the challenge with all of this is that there are a lot of very, very good sailors out there who have big gaps in their skill set. And at some point we need to try to address those gaps, right? Whether you're a laser sailor and you're just not spending much time on any other type of boat and you don't really know how to fly a spinnaker or trapeze, at some point that's going to catch up with you, and that's a barrier to the next steps. So how do you make the time to get out on a boat with a trap and a spinnaker and learn those skills? Brief side note here, little pet peeve of mine. The word pathway is poorly defined in my opinion, or it's one of those catch-all words that can kind of get you out of having to make a clear distinction of what you're talking about. And I understand why, because we're trying to describe something very broad. But in my opinion, there are a couple different things that you could use to define a pathway. One method would be to define competition levels. You qualify from your local level to the regional level, or your regional level to the national, or national and international. And that's this sort of ladder of the pathway. That's the pyramid, right? That's the traditional sports method, right? If you're a high school basketball player, you play in your local league. And if you do well in that league, or you win the league tournament, you move on to the state tournament, and so on and so forth. So competition pathway. Another one in our sport, and I think our sport is uniquely challenged in this area, is the equipment pathway. Progress from this boat to that boat. And that's probably the biggest practical challenge that most clubs and organizations face, or that kids and parents face as they're trying to move through the sport is, we were sailing this boat, the Opti, the Bic, whatever, and we're getting too big for it, or we're sized out, or we want to do something else. What's next? So the equipment pathway is a really challenging one. But I think the skill level pathway is the one that's sort of the most general and useful across the board. And it's something that we as US Sailing are well positioned to do, because we have a great education program, and we have a lot of access to instructors, coaches, junior sailing programs to help influence that pathway. And that's what we're working on. Yoakum asks a good question. What does fun mean in sailing? Very tempting to just stop the PowerPoint and pull up a different slide. But there's a woman named Amanda Visick at George Washington University who has done this fun mapping exercise. And what she did in a very sort of scientific way was ask a bunch of kids to define fun and group different types of fun. And what it really came back to is that the participation, belonging, the social side are really highly ranked with kids. They think winning is fun, but it's like midway down the list. And some things that we think are fun as adults, like travel, kids are actually not all, travel's fun, but it doesn't rank up there with having a blast with their friends or doing whatever else. So Amanda Visick Fun Maps is a good thing to look at. All right. So, you still with me? I hope so. I think there's a lag on the chat, so let's keep an eye out there. So another thing with that sort of squaring the pyramid, multiple pathways, is really tapping into the variety in sailing as a strength. And, a lot of other sports are in a situation where their sport is kind of very narrow and well-defined, and there's not a lot of variety in how you participate. In our sport, it's the opposite. We have tremendous variety in how you participate. There's, big list here on the screen of various natural factors, all the different boat types that are out there to explore, all the different positions you can play on a boat, and all the different sailing disciplines. And, whether you're talking to Leandro Spina, who's our Olympic development director, or you're talking to someone down at the local club, they're going to tell you that the more of these activities you can do and the more of these skill sets you can acquire, the better sailor you're going to be as an adult or down the road. Leandro really likes to encourage people to learn windsurfing, because windsurfing is sort of the most fundamental type of sailing. and teaches a great deal of balance, feel. It's just a very direct connection to the wind. So that's something that, there's a huge room for improvement on. So I'm going to show this next video here. This is a little bit longer, but I think it's really good. It's from this book called Range that came out this year. And it's arguing exactly for this case that people don't think about elite performers or top level performers as being generalists. They think they're very specific, but in fact, the generalists have a big advantage and are top performers. So we'll let him.
A new book argues you can be more successful in life if you learn different things and don't try to be an expert. It's called Range: Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World. Author David Epstein says diverse experiences are helpful in science, music, parenting, and even sports. One example, Roger Federer. He decided to focus on tennis after growing up playing several sports. David Epstein is with us. David, good morning. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
This is something, I spent years covering businesses, and this is something actually a lot of CEOs said to me, that they were always looking for people who were actually nimble, not necessarily laser focused.
That's right. And in fact, CEOs themselves, so LinkedIn just did research on 500,000 members and found that one of the best predictors of who would become an executive was the number of different job functions they had worked across within an industry, which kind of goes against everything we're told about just pick and stick.
Yeah.
I was fascinated by what you said about the 10,000 hours, because I so believe the 10,000 hours, that if you do 10,000 hours, you will become proficient at it. You sort of knocked that down, and then you even got Malcolm Gladwell, who first told us about 10,000 hours, to say, yeah, maybe you're right.
Yeah. Well,
what are you thinking there?
He said I changed his mind some. Not to mean that practice isn't incredibly important.
Yes.
But if you look, for example, at sports and music, the domains that we most associate with early specialization, when scientists study future elites in those domains, what they see is that they actually have what they call a sampling period early on. They do a variety of sports, variety of instruments, gain a breadth of general skills, learn about their interests and their abilities before they focus, and systematically delay specializing until later than peers who plateau at lower levels.
And this doesn't only apply to elite athletes or aspiring athletes. I mean, this is actually a quietly inspiring book, because so many of us these days, we live chaotic professional lives. You start in one thing, the industry changes, you have to do another thing, and you feel like that's a liability. But in fact, as your book makes the point, it's actually a unique advantage.
Wait, I like how Tony described your book, a quietly inspiring book.
Well, because you don't expect
I like that.
You think it's going to be a business book, you're in a rabbit, you're running through an airport or whatever. No. And it ends up being something you're like, you know what? I feel better about me having read this book. As a guy who was in print for a long time, and I'm on TV.
We beat ourselves up about trying different things.
Yeah.
Right? And, like Mark Zuckerberg famously at 22 said, young people are just smarter, right? But brand new research shows that founders of blockbuster startups on the day of founding have an average age of 46. They usually have to zigzag first. So we should drop our obsession with precocity and get to zigzagging.
Yeah, you said it's not really a sign of weakness or scattered brain. It just means that that when you start to focus, it really does make a difference.
Yeah, in fact, I'm taking your copy of the book, because there's a line in here that summarizes, in fact.
Do you have it?
Yeah.
I love the point you made about cardiologists. You said the best time the best time to get a heart procedure is when all the cardiologists are at a national conference, which surprised me. Why?
Yeah, not all of them, but the most specialized cardiologists. So if you're
ones,
checked into a hospital when there's a national cardiology conference and the specialist cardiologists are away, it turns out that they're so attached to certain types of specialized procedures that they use them over and over even when they're not indicated. And so the rates of complications and death actually go up. So this incredible study showed that you're actually safer going when they're away. So it's a problem to have people be that specialized where when all they have is a certain procedure, every problem looks like that kind of nail.
Yeah. What's your advice to parents who we're all worried about?
You're a new father.
You want to protect your kids for what comes, right?
Tony, he's a new father too.
Oh, you're a new father too.
Yeah, Tony's a new father too.
Yeah. Congrats.
Your baby, how old is Andre?
4 months.
How old is Teddy?
He is 6 weeks.
Oh,
yeah.
Lots of eye makeup for both of us.
And I have two wonderful older children as well. So what do we, as parents, what do you do? What is the lesson from your book to help your kids be the best they can be?
The only way they can learn what they're good at and interested in is by trying stuff. And the best thing you can do is expose them to a lot of things, help them reflect on those things. That's called self-regulatory learning, where not only do you expose them to things, but then help them reflect on, were they good at that? Were they interested in it? And the only way you can figure out what you can do is by trying things. And do not worry about missing the next Mozart or Tiger Woods. The way we tell those stories is not right. In both cases, those fathers were reacting to the child's display of interest and prowess earlier, not the reverse.
Not the other way around.
They're not parent created. As Tiger said, his father never asked him to play golf, ever.
Wow.
As he said, it's the child's interest that matters, not the parent's interest in having the child play. So you should not at all worry that you're going to miss that opportunity, because if it's there, it will show itself. And outside of that, the best thing to do is expose broadly and help them reflect on those experiences.
I love that. We can all take a breath. We can maybe get some sleep. And the line I found in Gail's copy of the book is, the message to people is, don't feel behind. You're making a change. You actually have an advantage.
Yeah, as people get more and more specialized, and as specialists see a smaller portion of all these complex systems in the world, having these diverse experiences, it's not falling behind. It's investing in yourself and in breadth, and that becomes a source of power later on.
David Epstein, I feel much better having talked to you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much.
All right. So thanks for sitting through that whole presentation there. But I think that's a really good summary of sailing, to be honest, of how someone who maybe is not the best sailor or most skilled sailor earlier in their life might acquire different skills along the way and come out to be a very, very skilled, very valuable sailor. So I have two kind of questions for the live stream here. Take your average sailor, youth sailor out there, your average kid that you bumped into at the launch ramp or whatever. How many types of boats do you think that kid gets to try, or different types of sailing even? Are they just sailing the one type of boat that you see them with? Do they ever go out on other types of boats? Have they tried anything outside of their, dinghy sailing realm? So throw a number out there. 2, 3, 1, 10. That's my first question. My other question is, think of, for yourself personally, as an adult, presumably, I think a lot of you watching are adults. Think of 3 sailors that you would want sailing with you on your next, whatever it is, whatever type of sailing you do, your next cruise, your next race, your next day sail. Are you looking for a specialist, or are you looking for a generalist? And, for example, are you looking for somebody who does one position on the boat very, very, very well and doesn't need to know anything about any of the other roles? Or are you looking for someone who's a little more of a Swiss Army knife and kind of can do it all? And maybe it's a little bit of both, but just curious. Generalist or specialist? All right, I see some of the comments coming in, 1 to 3, 3 to 5, 3 to 5. It was interesting. We had a panel at the Sailing Leadership Forum, the Ask Kids What You Want panel, and we had a couple of really great sailors, 3 awesome sailors from Southern California. And what came through from them was they're sailing all sorts of boats. Coronado Yacht Club, I'll give a shout out to them. It seems like their program is the type of place where the kids who are sailing lasers or FJs are also hopping on lightnings and snipes and doing match racing and, you name it. So it was pretty clear with that group that variety really came through and was leading to their success at sort of the Olympic development level. Now we're talking generalist, specialist. I mean, obviously, I guess if you can get a specialist tactician on board, can get you around the race course real fast, that's not a bad thing. Maybe it is a little bit of both, right? But, I certainly have friends in mind who I know would be great in a pinch when kind of the crap hits the fan, because they're really good at a lot of different types of sailing and a lot of different sailing stuff. I mean, we say sailing skills, but, we're also talking about fixing stuff, troubleshooting, boat maintenance, all that kind of stuff. Martine says, generalist, eager to learn. I agree with that. That's a whole nother category. Kind of goes into this next part. So I'll use this as a segue to our last section here. Retention of learning. So this is all sort of new to me, but a lot of this is in that book Range. And, I've heard a lot of folks at other sports talking about this kind of information. The difference between explicit learning, which is, basically instruction. It's coming externally, it's directed, it's deliberate, it's an activity. For example, that might be, hey, Timmy, try that tack again, but this time, put your left foot above the hiking strap, right? And they're like, okay, yes. So it's good for that specific skill, but that might be in one ear and out the other, in that the next time they go sailing, they're not remembering that specific tip. They've gone back to the old way that they were doing it. Can be very frustrating as a coach when that happens. So the skills can be repeated short-term, but with less long-term retention of that skill. Implicit learning, which is the internal self-directed learning, basically trial and error or mucking around with friends, or participating in some kind of a game type activity that's designed by a coach to challenge them with the skill, but they're not getting that specific instruction on that skill. So it can be designed by a really good coach. Those skills will take longer to learn because trial and error is a tough process, but they're much more likely to be retained. And that skill then is part of who you are. And as a sailor, you're going to take it forward. So this is the last video. This is from a guy named John Kessel, who is one of the coolest guys I've ever met. He is the director of sport development at USA Volleyball. He was our keynote speaker at the National Coaching Symposium this year, did a great job there. He's just a really cool dude. And you'll see here that he's got some really good common sense observations about how learning works.
The roles that everybody have in my sport, we say two things I think that are important. One, we'd like our athletes to be good at all the skills, but great at one or two. So if we let them do everything, we don't specialize them early. That's a big problem in this country right now, that parents are saying they're either this sport only instead of letting them do a lot of different sports, and saying, no, my daughter is this. I mean, I have little 12-year-olds that go, I'm a setter. And I go, great, well, you'll be a better setter if you learn how to hit. No, I'm a setter. No, we want you to do all the skills because that makes you better at the skill that you know on this team. I think another thing is we should start with this base that I'm not expecting you to make mistakes on purpose. And since you're not, when you err, it's just part of learning. Failure is part of learning. I think a story that I like to tell a lot of people as they coach and as their athletes. How did you learn to ride a bike? Did your parents hire a bike riding coach? You know, kids die learning how to ride a bike. They don't die learning to play volleyball that I've ever found. But did your parents hire a bike riding coach? Well, they didn't. Huh? Well, did they do any bike riding drills? Oh, they didn't. Did they send you to bike riding summer camp? No. Did they do bike riding pieces like progressions to put it all? No. Well, then how'd you learn to ride a bike? Well, your parents put you on it and held you for a little while and let you go for a little while. And whenever you crashed, they came and said, what are you crashing for? No, they didn't. They came up and said, are you okay? Because failure is part of learning. And that's part of what I think a growth mindset athlete and program needs to understand, is that when you make a mistake, they're simply opportunities to improve. They are not something that I believe you ever do on purpose. Therefore, my job is to guide your discovery. And when we talk about coaching, most coaches sort of have had coaches that tell you what to do. Now, that's called explicit learning. And it's the worst learned and the worst learned by being remembered and the worst way to problem solve new stuff. The best way you learn is this bike riding example. You learned it all on your own. I mean, there were no bike riding drills. You just rode a bike in different ways until you could ride. And some of the unicyclists and some of the mountain bikers, the things they do, Danny McCaskill, it's like, whoa. But he trusts himself and trusts his bike from what he learned implicitly. Well, it could take any sport that a coach or parent might be helping their kid with here. It can take a long time to learn it implicitly. So our role as parent or coach for an athlete is to be this person that guides their discovery. I have the wisdom of what is probably a good thing to happen. And I ask questions to guide them to discover it themselves. And that's because the best learned And the best retained and remembered in everything and creative problem solving for new things comes when they figure it out themselves. So how long has it been since you've ridden a bike? For some people listening, it might be 10 years. Get on the bike and what happens? You wobble 1 or 2 strokes and boom, you take off. Why? Because it was implicitly learned, not told to you what to do. So we need to fill this role of guided discovery as parents to just ask questions until the kid goes, oh, well then maybe I should, and you go, you got it. And that's the best way to learn it.
All right, so there's John Kessel. What's notable there, I think, is that he's not a youth sports person. He's in charge of their entire sport, director of sport development for USA Volleyball. They win gold medals all the time. He spends a lot of time with those elite athletes. So again, there's a clear connection here between what's right at the learning levels and the introductory levels of the sport and the outcomes that it leads to, not just for participation, but also for elite excellence. So it's not a one or the other, it's the same goal. And so I have another little exercise here for you in the chat box. We're getting almost to the end here, so don't be shy. Think for a second, just throw some ideas up there. What are some activities where kids get the chance to be self-directed and learn implicitly, right? They get to figure things out on their own. He used the bike riding example. That's a good one. I'm working on that one with my son right now. Took the training wheels off and he had a meltdown, so we put him right back on. But what are some activities that kids currently get access to right in this moment, they might be doing right now, that they get to figure out on their own? Or teenagers, for that matter. I'm going to give you a second to think. And then the follow-up to that will be, how can sailing emulate some of those activities or take some of the best practices? We're obviously in a situation where we're out on the water. There's a lot of safety, needs. And so we have to make sure this is all happening in a safe environment. There may be other circumstances. We can't really just push kids off the dock. But what are some sports that do that? And how can we figure out how to emulate that well? Meredith Dart says video games. Yep. I think that's the one that is really most clear. Parents don't even know how it works, so we can't help. Coaches, actually, I think there are some gaming coaches now, but it's a new frontier. The other one is skateboarding is a really good example, or anything that happens on the skate park is a great example of self-directed learning. And in fact, when John Kessel did his presentation at the National Coaching Symposium, he showed this great video of this skateboarder trying the same trick dozens of times. And all his friends are cheering him on, and he just keeps biting it. It was actually quite graphic at points, but then he finally nails it. And what his point was that those friends who were cheering that skateboarder on were providing that supportive environment. That was all the learning that was really needed, because everything else was coming from him. And you could see how motivated this skater was to nail that trick. Another relevant story, I think, is that a couple years ago, I was out in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, and I got to hear Buddy Melgus talk to a group of youth sailors. And he said that one of the ways he learned to sail fast and to sail well and sail tactically, or I guess strategically in this case, was growing up on Lake Geneva. His friend lived on the other side of the lake, and he would play a game, Buddy would, where he would launch his boat, sail to the other side of the lake, and see how fast he could get there, and challenge himself to get to his friend's house as quick as possible while sailing across the lake. And you can imagine how his ability to, sail the boat well, read the wind shifts, which are crazy on Lake Geneva, were developed from his own kind of implicit learning, rather than being shown to him on a whiteboard and then, in one ear out the other. So I think there really needs to be a balance. Playing guitar, that's another good one. Playing music can be definitely a trial and error type thing, playing tag, shooting hoops. Yep. Just things that can be done kind of on your own. All right. And so this is my last little section here. And then we're going to just talk briefly about implementation. This is just to ring home the point, push home the point that sailing is a late specialization sport. There's a lot of science out there, if you want to get real geeky, on long-term athlete development and the difference of athlete development for early specialization sports, such as gymnastics, figure skating, things where you peak. Literally, you're going to reach your peak ability at age 14, 15, 16, versus late specialization sports where you're going to reach your peak ability in your 20s, and in our sport, 30s, 40s, 50s. So we are so clearly a late specialization sport. And this is from that book, Range by David Epstein. And there's two diagrams I'm going to show you. So this first one here shows for this age range, the bottom axis there is age. So you can see it's 0 to 9, 9 to 12, 12 to 15, 15 to 18, 18 to 21. And then the other axis, the vertical axis, is the number of hours of practice per week. So what he's showing here is that for athletes in the 18 to 21-year-old range, not surprisingly, the elite athletes are putting in the most number of hours of practice a week. And the near elite athletes are putting in less total hours and a declining amount of total hours. So not surprising there. I mean, you think of top college sailing team, top college sailors, they're putting in more hours, they're more directed practice, but that's because they've reached that late specialization stage. What he shows in his book here is that for the younger age groups, so you can see the 15 to 18 age range is still the same here with the straight line and the dotted line. But in fact, at those younger ages of 9, 12, 15, the near elite athletes are putting in more hours of practice per week. And the eventual elites, the best sailors in the long run, in this case, this isn't about sailing, obviously, the best athletes in the long run are putting in actually slightly less hours. So it's sort of debunking that 10,000 hour rule that, as soon as possible, you should try to achieve 10,000 hours. And it's showing that there's a progression that is going to lead to the best outcome. Steve Keen, who's obviously a great coach with Lysot and is coaching some 470 athletes and 420 athletes now. He has a great metaphor that I borrow a lot, which is that creating a great long-term sailor is like baking a cake. And when you bake a cake, you have to add specific ingredients at specific times, and you have to follow the instructions. And you can't skip a step and then go back later and add it in. You can't go, halfway through and bake the cake and then crack an egg on the top of it and expect it to be a good cake. So all this is to say there's a step and an order along the way, and we need to think about what the right sailing at the right time is for each kid. So we're wrapping up here. I wanted to throw it out there to the chat room again. I've got a couple of examples in a second to share with you, but let's talk about implementation for a few minutes. What works? After seeing all of this and thinking about it, maybe you agree, disagree, but what are some practical ways to implement this? What are some things that you all see working at the local or regional level that that would be worth sharing? So go ahead and throw that in the chat box. And while you're doing that, I'm going to just, actually, I'm just going to wait. I'm just going to wait for the chat box. Maybe I'll take a second to plug a few of our U.S. sailing resources that you might find handy. Got a couple of good books for youth sailing instructors and coaches. This one is really appropriate for the youngest age kids, Teach Sailing the Fun Way. So that's one that is available and has really good games. This is all games and play-based type stuff. This is the Next Level Up. This is a new edition of Sailing Drills Made Easy. So this is full of more directed practice, kind of things that would be appropriate for high school or college sailing teams or race teams. This is all racing oriented. On the more big boat side, this is one of our best resources that's unfortunately doesn't get utilized as much as it probably should, the Junior Big Boat Program Guide. So this is your kind of turnkey solution for if your club or organization wants to get more kids out on keel boats. This is kind of modeled after a typical sort of 35-foot keel boat. This has the lesson plans, all that kind of stuff, and a U.S. Coast Guard exemption for the sort of, what's that called with the Coast Guard? The Coast Guard rules. All right, so we've got some stuff in the chat box here. Try it out sailing days. Boats rigged and ready to try. That's awesome. Short experience-driven programs for different age groups. Low commitment, simple learning and fun time in the water. Easier to target teenagers interested in less formal experience, right? Getting new sailors who are a little bit older out there without making it seem lame. Lanier Race Camp from Martine, new boat every day. That's awesome. I love that. Sail a new boat every day. Yoakum says add practices for all skill groups from late spring to fall. Regatta groups are only the ones sailing outside of the summer in New England. Justine says program mix-ups, putting Sabot Opti sailors into boats with 420 laser sailors. Awesome. Mix and match. Fred says playtime. Yeah, it can be as simple as saying you sailors are now empowered to spend the next 30 minutes just having fun and sailing. See you in 30 minutes. And I have heard it said that with every younger generation, it becomes more and more important to tell them, hey, you're allowed to have fun now. Now is fun time. Go ahead and have fun. Go ahead and goof off. Obviously, you need some parameters, but don't be shy. If youth opportunities to sail larger boats, absolutely. That's that junior big boat model, or a lot of clubs use J22s or sonars for that purpose. Increase the number of boat types dramatically and let the sailors run the events. Love that. If you have, a catamaran, a windsurfer, a Club 420, a laser, and a paddleboard, and it's like, hey, this is your afternoon, take what you want and go. For a certain kid, that's going to be a really excellent experience. Some kids are going to say, I want to get out there and I want to race. I want to be taught. And they can also get that too. One of the cool things I heard from this guy out in California, what's his name? Sorry, I'm blanking on his name, but he starts every practice by asking the kids, hey, what do you guys want to do today? And then from there, he builds his plan around that. These are great ideas. So a little bit here, just to wrap up, some things that U.S. Sailing is doing to implement some of these ideas and we've been working on for the last couple of years. The level 1 course and the small boat instructor certification courses, thousands of people get certified as instructors and coaches every year through those programs. And right now there's a new tool this year, a new online course called Teaching and Coaching Fundamentals, which is really rooted in this sort of baseline, how do people learn? And that was made in partnership with the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee. So great resource there. The Skill Up mobile app is in development. That's our mobile app here. It's in the App Store. If you look up Skill Up, you do need to be a U.S. Sailing member to access it. But that's kind of our delivery method for this skills-based learning pathway, and trying to put as many teaching materials as we can in the fingertips of instructors and sailors and parents, and got some cool things in development in the back end of that's going to be fun to play with in the next couple months. And then the Siebel Sailors Program, I'm sure a lot of you have seen information about that. Brand new in the last year, and really getting off the ground this spring and summer. That has allowed us to put a whole bunch of fleets of boats at community sailing centers with expert coaches, staff coaches from U.S. Sailing, and they're promoting, accessibility, retention of new sailors, and coach education in their regions. Sort of modeled a little bit off of what USA Hockey has done with their regional managers. So that's some U.S. Sailing stuff. You've already covered a lot of this info here, but here's some ideas for local implementation on all this. Add adventure sailing to your program. That's adding a multiple pathway for sailors who maybe aren't as interested in racing. They can stick with it with some other activities. Nevin Sayre has some great presentations out there. There's a great YouTube video of Nevin talking about adventure sailing that everyone should watch. Encourage sampling of many different types of boats and disciplines. Challenge kids, to go out there and try windsurfing or do bow on a keel boat or whatever it is. Here's an interesting one that hasn't come up yet, but just to plug it, think about putting your best instructors at your program with the beginning sailors. Often it's sort of the other way around. The most advanced sailors get the so-called best instructors, and different skill sets are going to fit differently here, obviously, but really good quality instruction with those youngest kids is hard, and it requires a good instructor or a good group of instructors to do that. Encourage free sailing. So getting out there and having informal sailing time. Alameda Community Sailing out in San Francisco has free sail Saturdays. And I think that's just an awesome idea. It's supervised, it's safe, but it's an opportunity for kids, parents, whoever, club members, come down and just go for a free sail. Use the club boats. Add a keel boat or junior big boat program. We talked about that a little bit. There's a good resource here. And then lastly, encourage intergenerational sailing. The youth sports box that we've been talking about, in our world, you can go out and race against adults. You can sail with your family. You can sail with your friends. You can learn from an adult. You can teach an adult. And I think that's a really important part of our sport that we can't lose. And we got to make sure that the juniors and the adult sailors are mixing together. I got into some great tacking duels when I was a kid with some great sailors from Rochester, New York, and they kicked my butt, even though they were like 50 years old, and it was a good lesson to learn. So that's some ideas there. I know there's a bunch more in the chat. Having kids teach other kids is also a great idea. What John Kessel said at the coaching symposium was, if he were us, he would have the 12-year-olds teach the 10-year-olds, the 14-year-olds teach the 12-year-olds, and so on. Make sure that there's this mentorship and peer-to-peer teaching as well. Joachim brings up a good point here, that this should not be interpreted to kill all racing. Totally agree. And that is a slippery slope. Maybe need to figure out how to do this presentation to incorporate more of the racing best practices, because I think what hopefully all of this would encourage, the squaring of the pyramid, is that kids who are really into racing from the beginning have the opportunity to do that. Kids who like racing but want to try other stuff can kind of zigzag their way through multiple opportunities and come back to racing as they want. You talk to a lot of parents and their kid wasn't into the racing side of things when they were 12, but then they joined the high school sailing team, and by 15, they're super into it, or they become a college sailor. So all these things should support that progression. It's not an either or, it's make the pie bigger. So with that, it's been an hour, so kudos if you're still with us. We can open it up to some questions, or Brittany, feel free to chime in as well, and happy to chat more about any of this stuff.
Hey, JP, and hi, everybody. My name's Brittany Manning. I also work with US Sailing, and I've been chiming in as US Sailing and myself in the chat to kind of guide some of the probes for questions and feedback here. I do have one for you right now, or two for you right now, that happened earlier in the chat that we've long since scrolled past. So here's a question from Mo Morrow, and she wants to know, do you think increasing program development, such as STEM programs, will help keep kids more interested?
Definitely. STEM. Thank you for that prompt. Absolutely. I think that there's a great opportunity to use STEM education in our sport. And I'll tell a quick story. Again, circling back to the USOPC, Stu Gilflin and I were at a meeting out in Colorado Springs at the USOPC, and it was a bunch of sport organizations like lacrosse and ultimate frisbee and all these different national sport orgs, and then a lot of different multi-sport organizations like the Boys and Girls Clubs, the YMCAs. And we brought along these Reach materials, Reach Educator Guide, first one and second one here. And they grabbed them out of our hands, the other sports, and they said, damn it, you're using science? Like, why didn't we think of that? And they were all writing down ideas of how to use science in their sports, because it's not only a great teaching tool and a great way to learn, but also a great way to get more kids access to sailing. Because if you, go down to Sail Newport with your 4th grade class, as they do here in Rhode Island, and you're getting to go sailing a bunch of times through the course of the year while you're also learning STEM in the classroom, then sailing is no longer this far off weird thing. It's something that you do, and you hopefully will come back for summer camp or something like that. So I think STEM is awesome. And yeah, total plug for the REACH program. This is the modules 1 through 10. This is 11 through 17. And these would be great to do at home with your bored kiddos during this quarantine situation.
Yeah, and on that, Jen Gamaris dropped it in the chat, but stay tuned to the Starboard Portal next week for some more STEM programming ideas and implementation that will be coming as well.
Nice.
All right, so we've got some more questions from the Peanut Gallery here. Earlier in the chat, I'm sorry if I'm butchering your name, it's either Yoakum or Joachim. What does the word fun mean when it comes to sailing?
Great question. Well, I think when it's obviously an open-ended question, and tempted to pull up this fun maps thing, but I think I'll get lost on the internet. But yeah, this Amanda Visek study, if you Google Amanda Visek, Visek, fun maps, it's a totally academic thing. So it's a bit hard to digest in a way, but the key information is basically that there's a lot of different definitions of fun for different kids. And a lot of it is more related to the social side of things, the personal fulfillment of taking on a challenge and being challenged and working through that, more so than say the immediate satisfaction of being given an award or getting a jacket or whatever. They have a lot of intrinsic, I guess. Kids are pretty tuned into the intrinsic part of fun, and we see a lot of the extrinsic stuff, but I think tapping into that intrinsic fun, and that's what you can tell when a kid has that in sailing, because they just won't stop. That's the kid who's like, I don't want to sail in, keep me out here. Or goes in at the end of camp and then has their parent watch them while they go back out sailing in the evening. So when you see it.
Fantastic. And then we've got another one that I think is an interesting question too. Is the lifelong sailors and some of this content being incorporated into our level 1 instructor training? And that is from Scott Corder.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think there's a lot of great evolution happening between the instructor training courses, which right now are undergoing some pretty massive evolutions to hopefully take on some more significant online components in the coming month, so that we can kind of get through this quarantine situation a little more smoothly and get people trained up. But, what we're trying to do is incorporate more of that age appropriate teaching that we've learned from the USOPC and mesh that with what we already have, which is a lot of great teaching, methodology that's been developed over the years. So yeah, I think that's an ongoing thing, but I think the instructor training courses, they're finite. They have a start and a finish, and people work their way through it, and they're graded and they're done. I think the real opportunity is with continuing education and with having more programmatic, systematic resources that allow people to do the right thing every day. Because we all know that you can go and take a course or learn a lesson or watch a webinar and then go back to your daily life and nothing changes. So how do we get in there more deliberately at the local sailing organizations, at the small clubs that have just a handful of instructors, and help them raise their game and do the right thing so that their programs can grow and more kids keep coming back. And that's what we're really most working on.
All right, and then we have an interesting one from BVI Kate in the chat, and she wants to know if you can talk about the tier 1, 2, 3 from a few years ago from McBride's presentation. She says that she uses it all the time.
Oh, I remember what you're referring to. but not well enough to talk about it. That was, I think, Willie McBride's presentation from the Sailing Leadership Forum in 2018. And he had, gosh, I wish I could remember. I wish Willie was on here. It was, 3 levels of learning, but I don't remember what they are.
No worries. I think we've got another comment from BVI Kate. She says, we also need to remember that little kids get scared, but often don't say anything. And the kids are more attuned to this than the instructors. So do you think that I have a follow-up to this, that, the peer-to-peer instruction kind of solves this? And B, do you think that there's a way that instructors, as the coaches and whatnot, can be a little bit more plugged into this as well?
Yeah, well, I'd be curious what your thought is, Brittany. So I'm going to kick it back to you in a second. But the first thing that comes to mind for me is, the being a young kid, being intimidated or scared by an activity. What's the support that's around you? If you're being pushed off the dock in a pram by yourself, you're going totally single-handed, you're not seeing a lot of avenues for support. What if something goes wrong? I'm on my own in this boat. If you're going with a friend, that's a little better, probably. If you're, brand new to the sport and you're going out on a larger boat, like a J22 or a RS Quest or whatever, and there's a junior instructor on board and you're just able to sort of take a sailing ride, maybe you learn and you rotate through some different things on the boat, but it's a lot less intimidating because there's a clear support structure and you're going to be okay when something's wrong. So I'm a big fan of that. Multiple people in the boat early on, and then add in single-handed sailing as the kids get more competent and comfortable. What do you think, Brittany?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think kind of going off of the ideas of giving kids more autonomy to teach them earlier, I think there were a lot of really good ideas in the chat. So if you haven't seen all of those, or you were not necessarily following along as John was talking, those points back there, some of them are really good. And I'm going to go ahead and give a shout out to my home program where I learned to sail and where I coached for a few years. Will Howard, who's now the program director of Lake Forest Sailing, mentioned a great idea that kind of does the 2 birds, 1 stone approach for that. And they have these bumper boat situation set up where we have a very small harbor in Lake Forest. And so they let their little luffers, which is 5 and 6 year olds sailing young prams, cruise around in a harbor that's got plastic docks. And I guess I haven't been back in a while, but they must close off the 3rd end or the 4th end to keep them contained more or less. So you get that autonomy, but there's little fear involved because they're not going to be able to go very far.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things too about depending on what body of water you're on, lake sailors have a bit of an advantage, not in the Great Lakes, but on smaller lakes where you're in a confined area and you kind of know that, hey, worst thing that happens is I'm going to drift over to that other shoreline. That's a pretty different feeling than if you're sailing on the ocean or one of the Great Lakes and you're kind of out there and it's just, you have to know your environment and know how to use it. And I would also say one more thing on that is that that's why you put your best instructors with the youngest kids, because they're more than likely to be tuned in, or your best teachers, to that and to keep those kids through that first couple steps.
That's an interesting approach too, because I think at a lot of programs, what ends up happening is that maybe the most senior instructors or the best instructors end up kind of growing with the race programs. Can you talk a little bit more about the importance of having them at the younger end and the more novice end as well?
Yeah, well, I think probably the most coveted instructor, I can't speak for all the people who run programs on here, but I'm just guessing. The most coveted instructor is that great personality who has the teaching skills and the safety skills and responsibility skills to keep the whole thing on the rails, but then just knows how to keep the kids super fired up and having fun, and kind of the learning is just happening, right? It's not being pushed on them. And those people are hard to find, that kind of camp counselor type. So getting those people slotted into the right roles. I think you mentioned the sort of racing instructors, and one challenge to be aware of is that a lot of sort of college sailors will go to college, they get access to really good coaching and really good structured practice environments. And then they come back to their junior programs in the summer and they apply those lessons to their, youth racing programs. And that's good as long as they're applying it in a age appropriate way. So if they're coming back and they're coaching younger kids, but they're trying to do the sort of grueling practice that they do at college with, 20-year-olds, they got to recognize that a 13-year-old, a 15-year-old is going to respond differently to that environment. And they need to modify their coaching method for the age. And that's really what the USOPC is driving home with their American development model, is that know your audience, know your age, adapt the coaching and adapt the sport to fit that age group.
For sure. Yeah, that model makes a lot of sense. Is there anything else that you want to add, or anybody have final questions that they want to throw in the chat? Otherwise, I think this has been a really great experience. Thanks, JP, for joining us. I think it's always nice to find an excuse to connect online right now while we can and have the time to, and for sure brush up on some of these skills that'll enhance programs around the country.
Yeah, let us know if there's things that resonate with you. If you have questions, just email youth@ussailing.org. Our youth team, we have a great staff right now, and would love to answer your questions. Anything ranging from racing development, Olympic development, to big boat sailing, STEM education, and obviously, learn to sail programming. We want to get you covered. So
All
I
right,
think with
good.
that.
Yeah, thanks everybody. We've got another session today at 4 p.m. with Jack Gearhart, our CEO. He'll be doing a live Q&A, so feel free to tune into that. It'll be a great session. You can find that again on the Starboard portal. And then coming up all next week and the weeks following, we've got a lot of really awesome content planned. So please stay tuned both this afternoon and forward. And thanks again, John, for joining us.
You're welcome. Thanks, Brittany. Bye, everybody. Stay safe.